So welcome everybody. It is our last session in the series of Unlearning the Activist script. Um, Sad, but also cool that we had this journey and that we can actually spend some time over the coming weeks actually properly metabolizing it. And for anybody who's just joining us for the first time, Anthea Lawson, who's here with us and molding and shaping this series, wrote The Entangled Activist a couple of years back. It was a text that really resonated with a lot of our community in Guerrilla, the grassroots activists we work with in Europe. And so this idea of bringing people together also to discuss some common scripts, blind spots, pathologies in movement building found some resonance. And today we're focusing on saviorism. We must be saviors, we must save the world. And we have a special guest, Satya Robyn, who's a psychotherapist and author of Dear Earth, Love, Grief, and Activism. And also a Substack to recommend called Going Gently. Without further ado, I pass it on to Anthea and enjoy the ride.
Thanks, Ivan, and hello, everyone. I'm Anthea Lawson. My pronouns are she and her. Thanks those of you that have come back. Thanks those of you that are here for the first time. It's really lovely to see all these names. And I say this every week. I'm a broken record. Thank you for the change-making work that you're doing. It's very easy to dive, especially when I'm thinking about it all the time, to dive straight into the, look, here are the things we're going to do to improve our activism, without just having a moment to take stock and sort of express some gratitude that we're doing it at all. When so many people aren't, when there's so much to do, when it's sometimes hard to do. So thanks for everything that you're doing. So we're looking in this series at the script that I think underpins our activism. It doesn't so much tell us the exact words to say, maybe sometimes, but I think what I really want to look at here is that it's telling us something about our role and perhaps about our motivation. It sort of helps shape how we show up, how we carry ourselves. So far we've explored urgency. We've looked at knowing the answer. We've looked at perfectionism, and we've looked at our deep ideas about the role of heroes. We could have spent at least a week on each of these if we were going into them deeply. They're huge. But it's been interesting. I've been noticing that these instructions on what I'm thinking of as an activist script have some things in common. And one of them is that, sorry, excuse me, I'm just getting over a cough. One of them is that there's more than a grain of truth in each of them. So with urgency, well, of course it's urgent. Of course it's urgent. I don't think anyone's trying to say that it's not. With knowing the answer, well, yeah, we do need to sound like we do know the answer. We do need to sound like we know what we're talking about when we're going up against the status quo. With we must make things perfect. Well, we do want to make things good. We want to make things better than they are now. We're driven by a vision that things could be a lot better. And the hero, well, inevitably, acts of heroism may be needed. Sometimes we do need to step out of ourselves and do something large, to do difficult work, step out of our comfort zones. So that's one thing they've all got in common, that there's a sort of, they're naming a sort of truth. Another thing that I see these instructions on the script as having in common is that in their overblown versions, which is the ones that we're really digging into here, this is how we see them operating, they can make our change making focused on us in a sort of paradoxical way. So knowing the answer, that can become a power dynamic where those who are trying to help, we can end up imposing our worldview and assumptions on the situation. This is going on in every charity and organisation that has people without lived experience of the problem trying to help those who have. With urgency, when we act urgently, our way of going about it in a sort of heightened nervous system state ends up setting the tone and the pace for everyone else. It can potentially put everyone on the tone, on the road to potential burnout. When we get perfectionist, the standard that we're holding everyone to, which is actually the standard we're holding ourselves to, gets projected out onto everyone else who we're judging for not meeting that standard. And this can create breaks and rifts in movements and groups, in organizations. And when we think we have to be the hero, including of our own story, we're turning it into something that's about individual action. We talked about that a lot last week, with us at the center. And we can forget that we might be the secondary character to something else, to someone else. We might forget that we're part of a collective. And so these two things, that there's a grain of truth in it, but also that this instruction on the script is sort of turning the spotlight back on us, is also true of saving, which is what we're looking at today. So look, would we help someone out of a burning building? Yes, we hope we would. Do we hope that our actions of protests can help perhaps towards saving people who are suffering grave violations of human rights, even if they're far from us? Well, yes, that's why we're doing it. That's why we're marching and protesting and writing letters and doing all of the things that we do. Can we save ecosystems on a small scale? Possibly. Green spaces in cities, patches of woodland, meadows, individual trees get saved from development by communities all the time. In the UK at the moment, I'm part of this, there are swimmers, kayakers, anglers, walkers, people who love rivers up and down the country trying to save our rivers and beaches from the torrent of shit that our privatised water companies are throwing into them. Last week, Sophie Strand, who was the guest here, told a wonderful story about how perhaps her whole life was leading up to being the side character to a woodchuck, sometimes known as groundhogs, who she rescued from a busy road. So, of course, we do want to save. Maybe sometimes we can. So what's the problem then? This is what we're going to explore this evening before we look at how we can identify that saviour bit in ourselves. So now's the moment to introduce Satya Robyn, whom I met online a couple of years ago, and we've been having fantastic conversations ever since. I realised, Satya, I feel like I know you, and we've not actually met yet. We're in different bits of Britain. I'm right down at the bottom, you're halfway up, and we need to rectify that situation as soon as possible. But look, so Satya, before we get into talking about the saving urge within us, would you like to introduce yourself a bit, including some of the things that you do, some of the hats that you wear, and the lights that they shine on each other in this context?
Thank you, Anthea. Yes, I will. And I agree. We need to meet in real life. Before I start, just reading some of what people are sharing. People just really struck by how much experience and wisdom is in the room, and really wanting to appreciate that and appreciate all the work that you're all doing. Sounds amazing. And get well soon to the 2 COVID sufferers. Well done. Extra points for getting here tonight. So I wear different hats. I have run a Buddhist temple with my partner, my spouse Casper, for 9 years now. I've been a psychotherapist for, I don't like it when you can count things in decades, but quite a few decades. And I'm also a writer. And in 2019, I went to an Extinction Rebellion meeting, and I think that Dougal Hine calls it the oh fuck moment. That was my oh fuck moment, and realized how much grief and anger I had about what was happening, realized what was happening in my body rather than just in my mind. And since then I've been involved in some activism. I've been arrested a few times and done work with faith groups in Extinction Rebellion, and quite a lot of vigiling. So I did a year's vigils every day for a year a few years ago, and at the moment I started in September doing a twice a day vigil and a prayer to the earth, which I do on Zoom at 8 o'clock every morning if anyone ever wants to join me, and in my local town later in the day. So I'd say that I'm still a beginner activist and don't do as much as I should. But I've also found that internal family systems, which is the way of looking at the world that I'm going to talk to you about today, has been really helpful to me in terms of looking at my saviour parts, but all of the parts of me that are involved in activism. So that's probably enough for now.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. So we wanted to think first, didn't we, about how saviorism shows up sort of in the spaces that we're in, and in activism more widely, before we kind of get into what's going on in us, just to kind of set a bit of context. Do you want to start?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? As you were talking about the topics you've covered already, I was interested in how hero and saviorism is kind of close, isn't it?
I find them very close. Yes.
Yeah, and I was wondering about you've probably thought much more about this than I have, but the difference between wanting to be the hero and wanting to be the savior. I think that it's for me it's the difference between this is maybe a bit early to be saying this, but an urge or a wanting to move towards doing something from a kind of a clear, clean, free place, and the urge coming from the savior part that needs us to do something in order for us to be okay, in order for us to be okay as people.
Yes, that's landing right in the middle of it, isn't it? And it's weird because I think some of that, it was funny, last week we were talking about the hero sort of in culture, in myth, partly because I was in conversation with a mythologist, and so these two sessions sort of work together in a way. But I suppose the hero can come from that as well. You know, we can have a need to sort of put ourselves in any of these roles that is coming from some place of unmet need. And then what's so interesting is the way that maps on to the external context. So what we have as an external context in Europe, I mean, this is so funny. So I did a history degree, again, we're talking decades ago, and I wrote my undergrad thesis on British missionaries in the context of empire. And I was focusing on them in one city in India, in Varanasi, the Hindu holy city, and looking at the conversations that these missionaries were having with the Hindu pundits, you know, and getting deep into the theology. But the context was saving souls, which is what the missionaries were doing, was the cover for the violence and extraction of empire. And there is a line that can be tracked. People have tracked this line through to the charities and ultimately the sort of international development sector of the 20th century. In some cases, like specifically through religious organizations, but sort of what in a wider cultural sense, that whole sort of movement, you know. And so that whole, it's a well-developed critique of the international power relations of the sort of international development and aid sector. But there's that big sort of context. So that's the context in which, if we are unconscious of what we're doing in ourselves, it will be very easy for that urge within ourselves to slot into an organizational framework. Now, a lot of these organizations are currently, they're in the latest version of this, you know, the calls for them to decolonize that structure and frankly shut that structure down, so many would say, you know, that's all a big topic which we haven't got the space to go into here. You know, that's all going on, and the latest stage of it is an agenda to localize and try and sort of give more power. But I think the argument is strong that it's baked into the structure. So that's like one part of a context we're in that sets a tone for what we then bring of ourselves, basically.
Yeah, really interesting that you talk about the impact that the system has on us and our personal psychology. That's really crucial, isn't it? And often missed out. And I'm also interested in how the systems got there in the first place, which I would suggest is because it's inside us already. So that the systems are there because we have a part that feels like it needs to save. We have a part that doesn't want us to be out of control. That those systems exist inside us and then become externalized and solidified, and then reinforce each other. The system reinforces the personal system
the
and the
parts
personal
that have
system.
become, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. The parts that do end up turning into culture through being the system are those from the people who were doing the colonizing.
Absolutely.
And so the problems in that culture, we're talking about whiteness here, we're talking about white supremacy and the saving built into that. So Emma Dabiri, who wrote a wonderful book called What White People Can Do Next, and it's got sort of short chapters. I think it came out in like 2021. And there's one, it's just a few pages, but it's really sort of like to the point, is denounce the white savior. That's what it says. So she's saying, like, let's turn away from the savior politics of that. But I think what I want to talk about is what it takes within us to make that political external move. It's going to be more than just a declaration in ourselves. That's not going to be enough. We can't make a declaration that we're not saviors anymore without looking at where it came from, basically. Just as with the hero, you know, the hero, you know, I've found sort of Jungian writers saying, you know, the hero complex is such a deep thing within us. It's such an old story. We can't make announcements that we're turning away from any of these things. Otherwise, we're back doing another thing that's on the activist script, one which we haven't done an event on, but it effectively runs through all of them, which is we're good. We're back into proving that we're
or that we're not terrible.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why these workshops are so crucial, and your work is so crucial. It's encouraging people to take the time to do that internal work, to be the change you want to be in the world. But there is something to that unless we really heal what needs healing inside, we're just going to be repeating patterns that haven't just come from us, but have been handed down to us by our own families, by culture, in general.
And we were going to have a moment in a minute just to see if there are any questions where we got to, but I just wanted to drop one other thing in quickly, which is about, I find often these lines on the script are a problem, not just for us when we're trying to do it, but they become a sort of barrier to people who perhaps would like to get more involved in change making, but think, well, it's not so much thinking, is it? They're sort of responding perhaps unconsciously to their perception of how the script operates. And so if you think the job of activism is to try and save stuff, you might perform a set of rational calculations and go, well, obviously I can't save anything, so what's the point? And I hear that a lot. People say, well, it's futile. Whereas if we had more of a spoken sense of we're trying to give some service here, would that open it up to more people? I don't know. I mean, I can't guarantee that, but that feels like
absolutely
a bit of it.
And I think that we're saying why having a saviour part is a bad thing right now. Is that right? Is that what we're doing?
Well, yeah, we're looking at it. We don't want to label it.
What I'd like to add into that, which for me is really crucial. You've already sort of touched on it. That for me, when we are behaving from a self-protective motivation, when we're doing the saviour thing because that's what we need to feel okay, what happens is we miss the other, that we're not actually able to see what the other may or may not need from us,
right? Because we're making it about us,
because it's about, we need them to be saved. So that's that agenda, and IFS talks all the time about agenda, that whenever there's an agenda, we're not doing good work.
Right. So that's our clue that something's up.
Or the agenda, well, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but an agenda of compassion or an agenda of curiosity is allowed.
Okay.
But anything else is a kind of a pointer towards the fact that our needs are more centered than they should be, or than they could be.
Right. Yeah, that feels really powerful, doesn't it? So we've got time to take like one or two questions if anyone has any at this stage. If there aren't any, that's also cool, and we'll just carry on because we've got plenty to talk about. You can stick your hand up or put it in the chat if you prefer not to speak.
I mean, I can just jump in because I've been monitoring the chat. That you've already touched on this element of what happens when it's not going to get better and there's this apathy, and kind of is that can be a trigger, an activation of saviorism, as well as, and that was potentially described to intergenerational trauma by one of our participants. Also losing sight of the bigger picture when your saviorism is activated, especially for other people's issues, and then kind of almost a distraction or diversion from your own, or organizationally, and then also being triggered by avoidable harms that you've either experienced or witnessed in the past. I guess that element of repetition, how that can kind of keep reactivating this mode. These are just some of the things I pulled out to make it flowier.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. All right, well, shall we carry on then? Do put things in the chat as they come up for you. So Satya, can you tell us a bit then now about
let me tell you a bit. So internal family systems is a way of looking at our internal worlds and the internal worlds of other people. And I always say this, and it sounds really sensationalist, but it totally changed my life when I encountered it maybe 5-6 years ago. I've been practicing as a psychotherapist for a long time, but this has revolutionized the way that I both do therapy and life. And so I'm a little bit of an IFS, what's the word? The word when you try and get everyone else to love it as well. I'm a bit of that. So do take what you like and leave the rest. It's based on a multi-mind model. So the idea that many great thinkers have had, Jung talked about it, that rather than being a cohesive kind of whole, we're made up of different parts that have different experiences, different motivations, different histories. And most of us are familiar with that because we might say, oh, part of me really wants to go out tonight and a part of me really wants to watch TV, or there's all sorts of conversations that go on, and sometimes that's just two parts, sometimes it's lots of different parts. And IFS was developed by Richard Schwartz, who was a family therapist, and what he noticed when he was seeing his eating disorder clients was that what they would talk about was different parts of them that functioned much as different family members would function in a family system. So in a family system, you get one person maybe holding all the dysfunction, or you get polarizations happening between different family members. What he was hearing was that the same thing was happening inside his clients' heads. And so he used his skills as a family therapist to look at those relationships and how he could help the different parts of people to kind of find more harmony. There are different categories of parts, and they're broadly divided into protective parts, which are always self-protective parts. They're always keeping us safe in some way, and exiles or younger parts. And the younger parts, the exiles carry burdens that we haven't been able to process. So they might be burdens of shame, is a really common one, deep sadness, fury, despair. So things that happen to us usually when we're very small and completely helpless. That the feeling is so big at the time. What our system decides to do is like shove it into a cupboard because it's too much. It would overwhelm us, would become unsafe, and so we just shove it into a cupboard, and then protectors kind of keep it shoved into a cupboard, basically. And we've all got that stuff. We've all got those young parts that carry wounding, and we've all got protectors that keep that material just sort of quiet. They both keep it quiet and they also keep it protected. So they've got like a dual function. They keep it safe and they also keep it from bursting out. And protective parts, as I'm talking, hopefully this is making some kind of sense with your own system, but protective parts are divided into two categories. There's the managing parts, which you can get a sense of from the words, and the managers are all about keeping everything moving, keeping it looking good, planning, lots of self-critical parts that try and keep us doing well, all that kind of proactive stuff that looks good, and is praised often in our society. And then we have firefighting parts or distracting parts, which are more reactive. So if emotion's coming up, the firefighters go, you need chocolate, or you need a drink, or let's just lose our temper at someone. So the firefighter parts get a really bad rep, both in society as a whole and in our own systems. We often have parts that hate the fire. There's often a big fight that goes on between the chocolate eating part and the restricting eating part, or the drinking part and the sensible, you've got to get up early part. That's a very common sort of conversation that goes on, or full-on fight. So the idea is that all the time these parts of us are working really hard to keep our systems steady, and they do all sorts of different things to do that. It's like these adjustments are always going on without us really knowing it. And the really great news is that there is something, this is what IFS proposes, and this is my experience, there is something that is not a part. And in IFS, this thing is called self with a capital S. It's a really bad word for Buddhists. It's a really, Richard Schwartz has had lots of stick from Buddhists over the years because they say, no, there's no such thing as self. So if you're a Buddhist, you might just want to think of it as a non-self. But what this is an energy or a spaciousness that has particular qualities. And those qualities are, there's 8 qualities as a way of kind of getting close to talking about what this thing is. When we feel compassionate, when we feel curious, when we feel calm, when we feel confident. I can never remember all 8, so I'm just going to stop there. But when we feel those things, that's a sign that we have self energy around, that the parts that are self-protecting are a bit more relaxed, and that self is present, and self knows what to do. Self doesn't get overwhelmed by emotion. Self doesn't have an agenda, and that's a really important one. Self doesn't need the other person to change in order to be okay. And so when we're talking about, when we go on to talk more about the saviour part, the saviour part will have an agenda, a very clear agenda, for a very good reason that makes sense to the saviour part. But when a part is in charge, the agenda is such that it's keeping us safe. It's not really tuned into what is best for everybody. But if self is in charge, what self naturally wants to do is what is best for everybody. Thank you, Ivan. Yeah, creativity, clarity, courage, connectedness. I did actually manage it once, but that's only once in the 6 years that I've yeah, so there's another really wonderful thing, 2 more wonderful things about IFS that I'll say before I hand back to Anthea maybe, or take some questions. The first is I love this and it really helps me in my activism. All our parts have a positive intention, and all the parts of other people also have a positive intention for the system of that person. And that is true for violent parts, for exploitative parts, for it's true for the parts of all the men at the top of oil companies. That what those parts are trying to do is keep that person's system steady. They're trying to keep the shame or the low self-esteem or the anger from flooding that person's system. And so they cause chaos. Yes, it's not okay, but that part feels like this is the only thing it can do to keep that person steady and safe. And knowing that really helps me with my own parts that cause chaos, and it really helps me with other people's parts. People might have blanking parts that just allow them to be very cold about things, or all of these things. There's always a positive intention. And the other thing that I think is marvelous about IFS is that when we're working with people, when we're helping people, when we're trying to be helpful, or with ourselves, we never do anything that any of our parts don't want us to do. So we always go at the pace of the slowest part. So there's always permission. Permission is always sought from all our protective parts. And my experience is that if we do it that way, we get there faster, even though it feels slower to start with. And there's probably some parallels with working with activism, because I think activism can have a kind of a pushing energy, which is totally understandable. The idea is that if we can work with the resistance, that allows the resistance to relax a lot more quickly. So that's probably a whole other topic, but those are a couple of things about IFS that I really love. So it's a gentle way of working with ourselves and working with other people, but it's also really powerful, because as we get permission, we can talk directly to vulnerable parts, or to parts that previously were just kind of, like I often talk about this, like the bouncers. You don't go into the club unless the bouncers allow you in. And what often happens is we push past the bouncers, and then the bouncers come and beat us up. So I'll pause there. It's quite a lot of information. So hopefully it's making some sense, and that you might be able to think about some of your own parts, or maybe some of your own exiled material that kind of overwhelms you sometimes. How it is to be an activist and have all of those parts going on.
It's just really funny, because I've heard you speak several times about IFS now. We've had several conversations about it, and each time something just really lands, and I'm like, oh God. Well, this is what we're about to do, isn't it?
That doesn't look like a good landing. Was that a bad landing?
No, it's just like me going, like it's those things that and yet as it lands again, something goes a bit deeper.
Yeah. Sort of recognition of
yeah. So it was when you said, self doesn't need the other person to change in order to be okay. And I thought about how many situations where I'm getting frustrated in my activism because I so want that person to do something.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's the whole point of activism, really, is we want people to change.
And this is the truth of it. We do want them to change. This is why there's a sort of subtlety to thinking about this in a way, and there's a sort of paradox about it. I do want my member of parliament to vote for a ceasefire.
What I would say about that is what we would like is for that person to want it themselves. So how can we create conditions where that's more likely? So it's up to them whether they change or not, and that's the thing that we talk about a lot in IFS, is that it's always up to the protectors are always in charge. They decide whether or not they relax or they stay protecting. And if you say to them, I really respect you, I need you to decide whether or not you want to do this, they're actually way more likely to relax, because they feel safer. They feel like they're not going to be bashed or sort of pushed up against.
There's probably a huge thing to explore here, a path we could go down, which we haven't got time to do, about what that means for we'll have to run this
for the and that really interests me.
What this means for our interaction with people in power when we so look, the thing we were going to do now, she said nervously, is try this out. Is try this out on me as a little illustration, and there's inevitable I suppose, limitations to this, because there's probably stuff I just wouldn't say in front of everyone that, you know, I would say if it was just you and I. That said, I felt ever since I started this work in 2015 that resulted in writing the Entangled Activist, and continuing this inquiry now, I feel that part of this whole thing of, you know, because I'm still being an activist, I'm trying to change activism now. I think that's what I get savvy about, actually, among other things. It's on my list now of things to get savvy about. Is anyway. So I'm potentially off on a long thing there. So I'm just going to stop speaking for a second, and take a breath, and let's do this. Basically.
Yeah. So just to let people know, we're just doing a short demo, which is a little taste of how it is to work with someone using IFS, and that the things that I say, you can learn to say yourself. So the thing with IFS is you can do it on yourself once you've got some kind of basic knowledge and have some practice. But this should hopefully give you an idea of what that process is like and how we start to tune into what's going on inside us and come into relationship with parts. So yes, so the intention is that we're going to kind of check in a little bit with the part of you that you said to me earlier, that you know you have a part, or maybe more than one parts, that have that kind of savior, those savior thoughts or savior feelings.
Yes, I'd say it's more of a feeling than a thought. It's more subterranean than something that expresses itself in words.
Great. So does it feel okay to begin to sort of get closer to that feeling? Are there any parts of you that have got any concerns or questions? Or
I think probably the part of me that's slightly concerned is the wanting to not fuck up in public.
Yeah, makes sense.
Sort of reputation concerned, being good, that
Absolutely.
bit of the script, that whole bit of me that wants to get things right.
Yep, great. So just to let people know what I'm doing. So when there's a part that's got a concern about us talking to a part, we pause. We always want permission before we go to the part that we're the target part. So we're just checking with Anthea's part that has that concern. Very understandable concern, not wanting to fuck up in public. I think most people would resonate with. And just wondering if that part's got any particular concerns about what might happen or anything that it's.
No, it's just a generalized concern, and that's what I was trying to say. And I got into a too long-winded way of saying it, but the short way of saying it is, I feel like the purpose of me doing this work the way I am now, which is to write and be honest about my own entanglements, including as a white middle-class person, but in every sense, really, is that if I don't sort of model it and sort of be vulnerable myself, then kind of what's the point? I'm asking other people to do something that I'm not prepared to do myself. So that sort of feeling about it makes it sort of okay.
Yeah, makes sense. I can hear that part. Really, it's really important to that part that you kind of do whatever you can and do it well in the service of this work. Is that right? And so that's kind of just connecting.
Yes, I suppose that's a different way of
to do this right.
That's a different way of repurposing my perfectionism.
Yeah. And also maybe it might have other purposes, which is protecting you from criticism, or that generally
that's a big one. That's what that bit's
about. So I hear that, and I'm wondering how this bit would feel about just kind of giving us a bit of space for us to check in with the savior parts.
It's willing to have a go.
Great. And if it wants to step back in and stop, just let it know it can step straight back in. So I'm really clear that we're not going anywhere that it's not happy with. Does that feel okay?
Fine. That's cool.
Great. So you said there was a kind of a feeling. Do you have a sense of where that might be in your body
it's
or
like
around your body? Great. Any other images or thoughts or?
It's a bit knotty in there.
Knotty. Yeah. Great.
It's not clear.
Great. Yeah. Bit fuzzy.
Yeah. Lots. All the not clear stuff.
Great.
This is not the only one.
Great. So what I'd like to ask you now, and this is a really crucial question in IFS, working with IFS, and it's a diagnostic question. How are you feeling towards that part now? How are you feeling towards that knotty
how is the rest of me feeling?
How are you feeling towards it? Yeah.
Sort of a bit tired of it.
Yeah, great. Okay, so is it okay for me to keep letting people know what I'm doing as
no, that's good. It's actually quite a helpful part of it.
Yeah, great. So the diagnostic tool is basically checking whether Anthea is in self or not. And when she says, I feel a bit tired of it, that says to me, that's not on the list of the 8 C's. That's not self. So there's a part that is really tired of this saviour one. And it would make sense that there was that part. So is there anything else that one wants you to know about this one, the saviour one?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think if there's a name, like as a way of kind of visualizing what this bit is.
The tired one.
That's tired of it. I think it's a manager. It's a kind of critic.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else it wants you to know about it, or is it happy for you to just know that it's just really tired of it?
Oh, I've got a whole gallery of critics, so yes.
they'd like another session of their own. Maybe let them know that you can check in with them later.
Yeah, I see you. I see you guys.
Great. Yeah, they're doing a great job. Managers are great. Managers do a great job. They're very underappreciated. So this one that's tired, how would that one feel about just giving us a few minutes with the saviour one? Great. Yeah. So now check in, see how you feel towards the saviour one.
I'm just performing a mental operation to see if it's my kind of cognitive thinking brain that is aware that if I say curious, I know that's on the list, and then we're into self. But I think also, so that's going on, and I think there is some curiosity as well.
Great. So let that thinky one know that I'm sure that you've got an amazing, lots of amazing thinky parts. So just let that one know. It doesn't have to worry. It can just relax, because we don't need it for this.
Back on the sofa.
Yeah, back on the sofa. And so there's a bit of curiosity, like wanting to know. Yeah. So if you can, just let this one know that you're curious about it. Let it know that you're here and that you have curiosity. Is it aware of you?
I don't really know, is the honest answer to that.
Is it that you can't see it, or what's happening there?
Yeah, it's just fuzzy.
It's fuzzy.
It's a knot.
Yeah. So maybe just let it know that you see that it's knotty, and if it feels okay, just kind of hang out with it for a little minute or two.
The thing that happens with me when I'm sort of getting a sort of resistance or can't quite go there is I'm straight into my head.
Yeah, great. So that's where you go straight up into there.
Yeah, that's my comfortable place. So I'm straight into thinking, and I've got loads of stuff to say about this. So it's
like, let me say stuff.
I've always got shit to say. So it's a challenge for me to quieten that bit down.
So just to reframe that, we never try in IFS. It's never about trying or being good at stuff. We're just meeting what's there. So what we would need to do, we'll maybe pause in a minute.
Yeah, we're going to have
to
pause.
We've probably had enough time. What we would do is we would meet that part that thinks, and we just check with that one why it feels like it needs to step in. What might happen if it didn't step in, if you were going to connect in with this knot?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense.
And that once we can get to the bottom of that, it will be more likely to step away, but we're not pushing it away. We're reassuring it so it feels like it's comfortable to do that. And then when you check in again and you say you're curious or you're compassionate, then a connection starts forming between you and the knot, which probably is quite new, because the saviour part would have just been talking to all the other parts in you for a long time.
And quietly sort of directing them.
They might have been annoyed at it, or it might have been trying to control them, or they would have been talking amongst themselves or fighting amongst themselves without actually being in connection with self. Yes, a lot of our parts don't even know there's such a thing as self. When they meet self for the first time, they're like, oh, there's a grown-up in here. Or
yes. I mean, I suppose what I'm about to say is me coming back into talking.
Yeah. So
Is
so
that,
any, just
yeah.
before we finish, any parts that have got anything they want to say before we pause that?
No, I'm just noticing that it is a thing to put all those other bits we identified to one side, even though it felt okay to do that. Like, that is a thing.
What do you mean?
Well, just as in, it is significant, and they're still kind of hanging around.
Yeah,
like,
let them know they can all step back in now.
critic manager is like, I'm not going to walk too far away because something might go down here.
Yeah, do let them know they can all step back in, and thank them for being willing to step aside.
Yes.
And for people that are watching, this does look strange to start with. Or I don't know about how you're feeling, but it can feel strange too, because when we don't usually talk to our parts directly like this.
Yeah, I found it very helpful when doing this on other occasions to give it a name as much as possible.
Yeah, what the different parts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because if you're trying to hold it as the one that does this or the one that does that, you know, that's why
It's up
like
to, or ask them. They might have a name.
Yeah, well,
they
that's
want
the
you
thing.
to
A name
use.
comes.
Yeah. Great. Yeah.
It kind of
No,
feels like
that's
critic,
good.
or it feels like yeah.
Yeah.
So the bit that really this isn't coming from having got to that saviour bit. This is coming from, I suppose, well, it was an instinctive response when you were talking about it. But it was something, and I suppose it is part of having just experienced, just in the last 5 minutes, that sense of the way that bit of me that likes to jump in and fix things and wants to make them better is very connected with those other parts. Like they're all there, they all are around it, because it's performing a fundamental is possibly the wrong word, but it's performing a really sort of important role in keeping something safe, or keeping me safe, right?
Yeah.
And I think what sort of the words that I wrote down as you were speaking were that I want to get things fixed so that I don't have to be uncomfortable around other people's pain. That's like great. That's the feeling of it. Because there's a sort of elemental very old discomfort around there, and I need to make it better in order for things to be calm and okay.
Yeah, great.
And when that makes intuitive sense given what I know about
when you say elemental or old,
life history,
the other way of saying that is that it's young, that it's a young part that's still that's had a very intense experience and then is still trying to do the same thing that it's always done. And that's pretty much how it is that we form in that kind of fire of being as vulnerable as a baby. And so that's when a lot of us kind of sort of
so this shaped. Is pre-verbal, and we might know I'm saying that we might know of things in our childhood, but equally we might not know of anything, and yet these feelings can still be there,
and the parts know, is my experience, is that even if we don't know, they're still holding it, they're still holding the experience. So that's where the healing happens, is that we can help them to let go.
So look, we were going to just do a little sort of give everyone a breather for a second here, weren't we? I think I need a breather.
3 breaths or something.
Yes. Okay, so let's everyone just take a few breaths, and then we'll have a little bit more conversation and questions. Okay, how are you doing? So I think we're going to, because we started 5 minutes late, if everyone's all right, we may just go a couple of minutes over, but not more than sort of 35 past the hour. But of course, it depends on what happens with the questions. So we may come to it, because there were a couple of other things we wanted to have a bit of a chat about before we go to the questions. And one of them was this this thing I started to see, that there's a sort of a polarity that forms between our sense of we must save the world, you know, and it's all on us, and a sort of collapsed feeling of it's impossible, you know, aka we're into collapse already. It feels like there's things go out to this extreme, and it's hard to find the space in the middle, because actually the space in the middle is where some kind of agency is that recognizes that we can always make things better than they are. And it seems to be that the saving frame is part of this, because that's what makes us, if we feel like we've got to save it rather than offer service, that's what makes us want to turn away when we receive information that makes us sort of realize, well, actually we can't do it ourselves. Do you see, I mean, obviously there's a lot of, I mean, there may be people here who know more about the climate psychology in this. There's obviously a lot of that there, but I wonder if, like, do you see a parallel in our sort of inner system of that polarity?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I'll answer it, maybe, I don't know, I'll say what's coming to my mind in terms of the parallels with how IFS works. We talk a lot about polarization in IFS. The idea is that when one part does its thing, the other part has to do its thing more to balance it, and then the other part has to do its thing more to balance it, and then it kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it sounds like you're talking about a polarization. And then the reason for polarization, for big polarization, is what would happen if that wasn't happening. And so the question to ask the part is, if you weren't saving the world, what's your concern? If you weren't making me feel despair, what's your concern? So despair also has a function.
What's the function of despair?
Well, great question. And it might be different for different people, but it might be that, well, if I'm in despair, then I don't have to engage with action. Or if I'm in despair, I don't have to be disappointed because I know that we're fucked already. So I don't have to experience that hope and then kind of crushing of hope. It may be that it keeps us away from something that's going to be dangerous, be different for different people.
Yeah. So if I just want to dig into this, because I feel like this isn't quite landing for me yet. I don't think I've quite got it. That if you say to the saving part, you know, if you're not trying to save the world, what's the concern? What might the concern be? Like,
so the concern might be, if I don't keep telling you that you can save the world, then you're going to have to connect with your horror of helplessness, or you're going to have to connect with how much grief you have about what we've already lost, or you're going to have to feel really uncomfortable that the other person's in pain. So it will be different for different people, but the savior part has a function, which is keeping you from something worse.
It almost feels like a function of some kind of numbing, doesn't it?
It can be numbing, yeah. Numbing is also
in all of
a
those
function.
examples, there's an avoidance of wanting to truly experience feeling something.
There's the fear that the feeling would be too much. So the fear is overwhelm. So we'll do this, and then we're not going to be flooded by that stuff, or we're not going to have to face that stuff. Okay. And often it's, you know, it's right. it's not that these protective parts are completely deluded. They're often doing what they're doing because they know that you have got stuff that's hard. So it's easier to do the thing that you're doing than it is to do the alternative. You know, even though the thing you're doing might be really painful, because, you know, being in despair is not fun. Ivan said that he's in his despair era, that's not a fun place to be. And often what happens is the protective function causes a lot more pain probably than would be true if it wasn't protecting you. But that protector doesn't know what else to do, so it just keeps doing it, keeps producing the despair, or keeps giving you ideas about how you can be a savior.
No, that makes sense. So look, there were a couple of other things I wanted to bring up, but I'm also seeing that there's some really, really excellent questions coming in. So are you happy for us to let's see
Very
where the
happy.
conversation proceeds
Yeah.
with that, and the other stuff
Yeah.
may or may not come in, but I really want to sort of meet the questions and see where
I,
people are at.
I just wanted to thank you both for taking us this far, and I think if any kind of trend that we can set, it's that we start adding more psychoanalysis into movement organizing spaces. This thing of like, if you if you don't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love the earth? There's going to be lots of this. There's vast icebergs of inquiry into what has been raised today, and flipping the micro to the macro level. You can really do narrative analysis of movements around the world. So I think that's just a portal that we are becoming more appreciative of at scale. So yeah, thanks for kind of spearheading that for us. Or perhaps a less militaristic, violent verb for that. Thank you all. I'm going to stop recording, and this is our finale.